Lesson 3 is about assembling the rough cut. So to begin with, we switch to the edit page. We again go over the edit page. Anytime you go to a new page, you always explain the interface, at least briefly enough so people get an understanding of what they're looking at. To begin with, what we do is we create a new bin, and we call it Rough Cuts. And then we create a new timeline. And this can be first rough cut. And we talk about organizing your timelines, and we color code this to be a color. When you color code it, it won't look like a color until you click off it, and then you'll see the color. But now we have our bin, and we start to edit into the bin. So we come into our interview, we take our first shot, we add an endpoint. We use this overlay here because the first clip has nothing in the beginning, and we just before he says in this film, that's where we mark an endpoint. We talk about the shortcut keys this time, and then we play it down to where he says making all things possible.
Is connecting and making all the things possible.
And that's where we mark our out point with the O key. Now we have our in and out point, and we can preview it before we even edit it into our timeline to make sure our in and out marks are the same. And you can come up to your playback, and then you can come down to play around and come into where it says play into out, which is option / on the Mac. And when you say play into out, you'll play from the in point to the out point. What you can do then is edit it. And here we talk about the edit overlay. So we drag from the source into the timeline. We explain the edit overlay just briefly. And we say we can, since overwrite is already highlighted, we can drop this anywhere and it will add it as our first shot. Normally you would play that, but we're going to go right into our second clip. We're going to load that in, double click O2 if it was possible. For this one, what we're going to do, we're going to mark an endpoint when he says if it was possible to shoot it. To do that, we use our J, K, and L keys. And you would just J, K, and L back and forth to that clip. So if it was possible to shoot it is the first line.
7 continents, 18 countries. It was very important that everything was real. If it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to know where to shoot a little top.
Right, you use J, K, and L keys to go back and forth to find that point. You'll see in the waveform display, there's a little gap there. Mark an in point. The out point is going to be every shot was original and every shot was real. That's further down.
If the shot wasn't right, we would either go back to that location or make the movie. It was really important. Every shot was original and that everything was real.
And then you can mark your out point with the O. For this one, what we're going to do is we are going to make sure that the playhead is at the end of the timeline, and you talk about, the playhead being your in point for your timeline. You can do the option / if you want to play from in to out again to rehearse it. And then we can do the same overwrite, but this time we use the toolbar, and we can show them in the toolbar. If you hover over it, you'll see the 6th button is your overwrite button, and it's F10. So you can either use F10 or you can click the button, and now you've added your second clip in there. Now we change to inserts, and for that we actually go to B-roll. We first put our playhead in between the two clips. We go to our B-roll. We start off with this South Pole clip, which is number 08. And we just mark an in point right when the tail, it's very arbitrary. We're just choosing some place identifiable. And one place is when the tail comes from behind this yellow sign. That's a good place for our in point, so we can mark in. And then we just let it go to the end, and we don't need a mark. You can see the shading tells us we don't need a mark here. For insert, we do it through the edit overlay. So we just come in and we drag in and we hover over insert and we insert. Now you can see we've inserted them in the middle. But you can also insert in between, in the middle of a clip. It doesn't have to be between two clips. It can split a clip. For that, we use the next clip that's in the timeline. And we come over here and we just hear him say,
location, stay at that location longer, or it didn't make the movie.
Or it didn't make the movie. It's good to show them how to zoom in at this point and use the waveform.
Longer, or it didn't make the movie.
And you can see that's where the word ends right there, using the zoom in slider, the zoom slider in the toolbar, and the waveforms to see exactly where we're going to split this clip. For this one, what we do is we come over into our B-roll bin and we choose this Milky Way clip, We can say we're going to take the whole clip, and instead of dragging into the timeline viewer, we can use the insert button that's in the toolbar, and we just show them that. Obviously, this is going to fill your screen, so you can remind them that they have Shift Z to see the entire timeline. You might want to play that back so they can see it. And now the next edit we do is we use timecode numbers. So we begin coming to this 05 Bay Area shot, and let's say from the beginning we want to come in 1 second. We can just type on our keypad plus 100, and that moves us 1 second in. That can be our in point. We mark an in. And then we can say we want this to be 4 seconds and 10 frames long. So plus 410, enter. That jumps us forward. That's our out point for the O key. So you're just teaching them how to use the keyboard to move the playhead in the source viewer. Very simple. The timeline playhead is going to be at the end of the Milky Way clip where you've last left it. So you want to remind them that that's where you're going to position it if they moved it. And this is going to be another insert. So we can use the toolbar. We can just say insert or F9, however they want to do it. And then they can review that and play it back. This is where you teach them that if they're going to use keyboard shortcuts like to move forward, plus and minus, use the J, K, and L keys, use the F keys for editing, that they have to know which viewer that they're actually going to be operating on. And the way you know which viewer is active is by the red name above the viewer. So you can show them that right now the timeline is active, and if you click on the source viewer becomes active. Q is a nice little keyboard shortcut that toggles between the timeline and the source viewer. So if you're keyboard oriented, you can use Q to go between them. You can use the keyboards to enter in to move the playhead and to use the editing functions. Okay, the next part we do is we start to talk about taking an individual track, like video only, from a source clip. So right now we've only been doing whatever came in on the clip, but now we want to take maybe just the picture without sound. For that, there is one clip in the B-roll that does have sound on it. So what we're going to do is first position our playhead, and we're going to position it between the 08 and the second interview clip. So it's right after the South Pole. That's where the playhead's going to be. That's where we want to add our next shot. The only clip in the B-roll bin that actually has audio with it is this jet landing clip. So we're going to double click that and load that. Now, instead of picking some in and out point in the source viewer, you tell them that they can also pick in and out points in the timeline viewer if there's something that's in the timeline that's going to determine how long we want a shot. For instance, here, we want it to be during his first sentence. So we're going to mark an in point right at the beginning of our O2, if it was possible, clip in the timeline. So I'm just going to mark an in point, and you can see it now become shaded up the top. And then we're going to play through it, and you'll see here his first line, which is, if it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to go shoot it. And you can use the waveform to make sure that you're in between the words. That's going to be our out point. We just mark an out point. Now we just need to find an in point in our source viewer. And what we choose is someplace like where the wheels first come in to the clip. Or you can choose when they're just out of the clip. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And we're just going to mark an in point there. So now we need a way to only take the picture and not the sound for this. So this is where you talk about the destination controls in the timeline header. So here's the timeline header at the beginning of the timeline. We can say this is the source, it has video and it has audio. If we click on audio 1, it won't take audio. And if we make an overwrite edit, however they want to do it, they can either drag into the timeline viewer or use the overwrite button. And now it just gives us this overwrite edit of picture only, not sound. And you can play over it so they can see it and make sure that it didn't take the audio. The next thing we do is we talk about cutaways. So we talk about this being one kind of cutaway where you edit it on the same track. Another type of cutaway is when you use a separate video track. So we just go to the end of the clip we just edited in, the 04 jet landing. That's where we're going to add our next cutaway. That's going to be an in point in the timeline. Again, we're going to use his sentence in the timeline to determine the out point. So he says one more sentence in here. So he says, if you couldn't get the shot or the weather wasn't right, and when he says weather wasn't right,
the shot or the weather wasn't right,
And you can see that little peak in the waveform to know that you're at the right spot. You can mark an in point. That determines the in and out point for our cutaway, our next cutaway. We're going to choose this Arial SFO clip, which is right here. It's 03 Arial SFO. You can double click it in. Again, you're picking some arbitrary point. I'm just picking it where the nose touches the yellow line. It's just some place that I remember. I'm going to mark my in point right there. And you can see it shades it, so it is going all the way out, but that's okay because we have our duration marked in the timeline. Now, instead of doing an insert or an overwrite, we're going to drag from the source viewer into the timeline viewer and talk about place on top. And place on top is going to do just that. It's going to edit it on top of the current video track. And that's another cutaway. So visually, it's the same as the jet landing. We hear his voice, but it cuts away to the clip. And then when it's done, it cuts back. So you're just explaining the two different ways to do cutaways. The next thing is the easiest one. It's append to end. So we're just going to show the 11 movies clip. And you can see that this is the credits for that. We're just going to drag from the source viewer. Doesn't matter where my playhead is, and it doesn't matter that I can't see the end of this. I want this at the end, the credits at the end. So I just drag and drop and say append to end, and it automatically puts it where it is. It's probably the easiest edit that they'll make in Resolve. And then you can tell them about Shift Z again to see the entire timeline, just reminding them of that. So now we're going to edit directly from the bin. For that, we increase the thumbnails a little bit so you can have 2 rows and see them more clearly in here. And we use 01, 02, and 09 are the 3 clips that we use. So 01, which is this A380 taxi. So what we do is at the beginning, we skim over it and mark an in point right at the beginning, just using the thumbnail. Then we skim, and I go to about where the nose of the plane is pointing straight up. Just another place that I remember it, and I mark an out point. Then I just move on to the 02. Again, at the beginning, mark an in point. When the Lufthansa logo goes off screen, I mark an out point. And then the last one is this Hawaii landing 09 clip. Again, at the beginning, and then just somewhere in the middle, maybe when Hawaiian Airlines goes off the screen, the logo, I mark an out point. So now we have those 3 clips marked, and we talk about editing them into the timeline all at once. So we want to figure out where our timeline has to be. We're going to place the timeline right before the movie credits just to make it easy, right there. We're going to select all 3 clips. You hold down the command or the control key to do this on Windows. So the command key, and we'll choose 1, 2, and 3. And then you just drag them into the timeline viewer to see the edit overlay, and you can just choose to insert these, and all 3 clips will be edited in, pushing down the credits. We'll do a Shift Z. The last edit that we make here is a replace edit. And so the replace edit is, we do this twice. Obviously, we do it once here and once in the audio on the edit page chapter. But this one, we're going to zoom in using the time bar zoom slider. We're going to zoom in on this 04 jet landing clip. And we're just going to find a point, like say, right, not quite in the middle, maybe right where these jets the engines start to come into the frame. That's about where the plane might be directly overhead, right? And we want to replace that with another shot. We're going to use the 10 Maldives clip, and we're going to find a shot where that plane is roughly in the same position as the plane in my timeline, right? We're just going to match those. I don't know anything about the in point or the start or end about this clip, or the start and end. I don't have any endpoints in my source clip, but the replace edit, which is located here in your toolbar, or if they want to drag it, it's also right here. The replace edit will line up this playhead in my timeline and this playhead so that this frame lands exactly where this frame is in my timeline when I make the edit. And then Resolve will figure out, it will backtime it and figure out where it needs to make an in point and where it needs to make an out point in order for this clip to fully replace the one that's in the timeline. So to do that, we're just going to drag and say replace. And now you can see one clip just replaces the other, and the frame that we're on is exactly the frame that was in the source viewer. Okay? And if they don't understand that quite yet, don't worry too much about it, because we do it again and it maybe hits home a little bit more when we do it in the edit on the audio page lesson. But that's the end of this lesson 3.